a news outlet that educates Dons on what's happening on our campus, in our world, and how it affects us. Today we'll be talking about a subject that needs to be addressed. We'll be talking about institutionalized racism. Although USF prides itself on being woke, some still fail to recognize that racism still exists in our country. While times have changed from lynching and hosing, institutionalized racism still remains having a major impact in American society. Our nation is still divided by the color of our skin. White skin is still glorified and seen as superior, while darker skin is still marginalized. In an age where so much progress has occurred, there is still so much work to be done. We have come a long way from those words spoken by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the March on Washington on August of 1963, yet we are now faced with a different form of racism. Institutional racism in the United States is our modern form of racism, impacting low-income communities and minority groups. Within the next few minutes, you will hear about the effects of institutionalized racism on its subdivisions, including systemic racism, school to prison pipeline, gentrification, and environmental racism. You will feel beautiful artwork from protesters and hear from groups that are trying to put an end to our modern form of racism. Now, let's go to Jade, who will give us some more insight on the background of systemic racism.
Racism against Black students began in the United States with the beginning of slavery. During times of slavery, a slave patrol was created in the South in order to capture and return or kill runaway slaves. This slave patrol became our modern-day police force. Racism against Black people was carried out systematically in our country through segregation. During segregation, Black citizens were denied most jobs and commonly worked as janitors, maids, waiters, and other blue-collar jobs. In addition to being limited in which jobs they could have, they often made far less than whites, which ultimately forced them to live in packed cities rather than suburbs. As you can see, this has shaped the modern-day stereotype of bigger cities, which are more packed and facing severe poverty and violence, such as Chicago, being associated with Black citizens, while wealthier and safer suburbs are associated with whites. In this way, Black citizens were forced into segregated housing, which can be seen today even after legal racial segregation ended. This is extremely harmful because it causes a violent cycle of poverty, wherein people of color living in low-income neighborhoods typically receive poor education and sometimes therefore cannot obtain a college education and/or well-paying career, and ultimately stay stuck in the cycle of poverty, doing low-paying and often laborious jobs. As these people of color struggle to make it by in their already low-income neighborhoods, white people then move into these neighborhoods and begin to buy out businesses and families who have been there for generations and can no longer afford to stay, therefore gentrifying the neighborhoods and ultimately shoving people out of their own neighborhoods. Additionally, the systematic racism contributes to social racist stereotypes such as Black citizens living in poor and dangerous neighborhoods, being more violent or dangerous, committing more crimes than whites, etc., which has led to another form of systematic racism, excessive policing of Black people, police brutality, and the murder of innocent Blacks, imprisonment of innocent Black people, etc. In addition to Black people being essentially forced into crammed and lower income cities, these urban neighborhoods are often placed near dangerous environmental settings, such as freeways emitting high levels of carbon monoxide and smog. This is just one example of environmental racism. In addition to institutionalized racism in the forms we've previously discussed, the school-to-prison pipeline is another form of systemic racism in which Black youth living in poverty are ultimately destined for prison through a racist school system which punishes Black students far more commonly and harshly than that of white students.
Now let's go to Ashley, who will be telling us about gentrification.
We are in a new era that is working to end gentrification. Finally, people are starting to realize and talk about institutionalized racism and its effects on where different groups of people reside. In an article posted by the LA Times in April of 2018, for the last 55 years, Fidela Lozano has witnessed her neighborhood of Lincoln Heights, located in Los Angeles, California, be taken over by gang violence, crime, and police oppression. Yet the neighborhood has changed due to Silver Lake, Echo Park, and Hollywood, turning their neighborhoods into well-appointed artsy enclaves for professionals with Audis and six-figure incomes. In August of 2017, Villasano was notified by her landlord that she must move out within the next few months. Villasano, along with many other minorities, are being squeezed out by white home buyers because of the neighborhood's close proximity to downtown and the commercial district. Although gentrification still remains, there are groups working to put an end to this form of racism by exercising their right to assemble. Within the next few minutes, you will hear about a movement and organization in the summit that have occurred in hopes of one day ending gentrification. Let's talk about an organization that nationally is trying to make a difference. Although gentrification still resides heavily in minority communities, there are national organizations that are working to end the cycle of institutionalized racism. The first organization is Right to the City. Right to the City is a national movement that is response to gentrification. They are urging the halt of displacement of low-income groups, including people of color and LGBTQ communities. Right to the City builds infrastructure for grassroots organizations, coordinate national campaigns, and facilitates national convenings. They've started Homes for All, which is a national campaign which works to protect, defend, and expand housing for communities that have been marginalized. According to Homes for All in 2018, their mission statement is, "We are challenging the absurd assumptions that the housing crisis is over and that the market still holds, if any, of solutions to our problems. We believe our government has a responsibility to create and strengthen laws and programs that will allow our communities to flourish." They have won national policies that protect homeowners, shifting the national debate on housing, and have supported efforts for affordable community housing. Not only nationally are people trying to make a difference, but also locally. Nearly 50 organizations, including Housing is a Human Right, came together to protect and defend our own communities. Last year in Los Angeles, my home city, more than 800 activists and citizens took to Lemur Park for the Resist Gentrification Action Summit. Nearly 50 organizations, including Housing is a Human Right, discussed their initiative to repeal Costa-Hawkins and advocate for Proposition 10, which strengthens protection against rent increases. Costa-Hawkins is a state law that restricts local governments from enacting rent control or stabilization rent measures for newer buildings. The summit brought awareness to Los Angeles residents on the need to repeal Costa-Hawkins and also advocated for Proposition 10. The summit was also centered around talks and breakdown sessions about protective strategies and the notion of community strength. Housing is a Human Right works to help Californians with skyrocketing rent, eviction, and combat homelessness. According to Housing is a Human Right in 2018, the median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles is $3,200. At the summit, there were other organizations in attendance talking about the impact of race on housing. Black Lives Matter, Youth Justice Coalition, the Alliance for Safety and Justice, and others discussed organizing to resist criminalization of Black and Brown people through gang injunctions and clearing the streets. The third organization is the Leo T. McCarthy Center, located in the Masonic Building. USF is becoming more aware of the history of our neighborhood in San Francisco. On campus, the Leo T. McCarthy Center is committed to fostering a level of understanding about neighborhoods in San Francisco, including the Castro and the Mission, and the community's identity. The Castro is known for its long history of being a safe haven for people that identify as LGBTQ. Also, the Mission has had a history of being predominantly of Latin roots. The Leo T. McCarthy Center fosters questions about the right to housing and the notion about neighborhood identity. The Leo T. McCarthy Center has started Engage San Francisco, which draws on the resources of USF in order to meet communities' needs. According to David Donahue, the director of the McCarthy Center in 2018, this initiative acknowledges the community's knowledge and cultural wealth of the Western Addition and recognizes the challenges of gentrification and the out-migration of African Americans in this neighborhood, which has historically been known as the Harlem of the West. The Leo T. McCarthy Center aims to educate students and faculty on the history of the city in hopes of ending gentrification. Although the fight to end gentrification is a long road ahead, groups and organizations are working to educate and bring awareness on gentrification, slowly deconstructing institutionalized racism. Through acts of peaceful demonstration, people are standing up and using their voices to make a difference. Whether it be a movement, an organization, or a summit, people are working together to fight injustice. Hopefully in the future, what happened to Fidel Fasano in our neighborhood of Lincoln Heights will not happen to anyone else. Now let's go to Raquel, who will be telling us about environmental racism and some steps we can take to fight against it.
According to The Atlantic, in 2018, the EPA released a report saying that environmental racism is real. People of color are much more likely to live near sites of toxic waste and pollutants that cause serious health concerns. Due to social policy put in place through institutional racism, climate change and environmental destruction are affecting communities of color and low-income communities disproportionately. First, I will discuss what environmental racism is. Then I will discuss what led to environmental racism, and then I will discuss steps we can take moving forward. So what is environmental racism? According to Green Action in 2018, the environmental justice movement has broadened the perspective of the environment beyond the scope of conservation and preservation of natural resources, and has defined the environment as where we live, work, play, learn, and pray. In order to understand this segment, let's first discuss what environmental racism is by defining it. According to Green Action in 2018, the environmental racism is the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color. Environmental racism refers to the institutional rules, regulations, policies, or government and/or corporate decisions that deliberately target certain communities for locally undesirable land uses and lax enforcement of zoning and environmental laws, resulting in communities being disproportionately exposed to toxic and hazardous waste based upon race. Environmental racism is caused by several factors, including intentional neglect, the alleged need for a receptacle for pollutants in urban areas, and a lack of institutional power and low land values of people of color. It is a well-documented fact that communities of color and low-income communities are disproportionately impacted by polluting industries, and very specifically hazardous waste facilities, and lax regulation of these industries. Let's explore some of the causes of environmental racism. According to Diaz in 2016, there is empirical evidence that environmental injustice is caused by many factors, including discriminatory siting, misguided regulatory policy, unequal regulation enforcement, and unequal political power. These factors do not function independently. Low-income and minority communities are often more likely to have less political power, and communities with less political power are less likely to have their voices heard by regulators. However, research that establishes each factor's role in creating incidents of environmental injustice lends credence and actionability to the environmental justice movement. With empirical proof of its causes, policymakers have multiple avenues through which they can combat environmental justice. Now that we've discussed causes and explanations, let's see where we can go from here. According to Green Action in 2018, environmental justice is the movement's response to environmental racism. There are currently 2 legal avenues available to communities seeking environmental justice: the regulatory administrative action and the court action, neither of which are mutually exclusive. Both of these avenues, however, should be considered only within the context of a broader strategy of empowering the affected community to have an impact on the conditions of their overall quality of life. According to Hurwitz and Sullivan, the collective experiences of the environmental justice movement since 1979 have proven that the use of litigation as a movement strategy is of limited value. So what else can we as individuals do to get involved? There are protests, grassroots movements, legal action, etc. You can talk to the people around you and find out what they know. Join a club combating environmental racism or for environmental justice. Go to a protest, sign a petition, vote, rate your representatives, and check your privilege. In this segment, we only touch the surface of what environmental racism is and what factors contributed to it and what we can do moving forward. When you look at the facts, people of color are disproportionately affected by pollution and environmental degradation that is mainly caused by the world's top 1%.
Next, you will hear from Sada, who will be talking about the school-to-prison pipeline and the correlation between students of color and the criminal justice system.
There is a history of discrimination towards people of color in America, and it has trickled down to the education system. The school-to-prison pipeline can be defined as a process of criminalizing youth that is carried out by disciplinary policies and practices within schools that put students into contact with law enforcement. This has been the result of what was meant to keep children safer on school campuses following the rise of school shootings in the 90s. Considering the history of institutionalized racism and the targeting of Black and brown students in America, it may come as no surprise that these 2 specific groups are the most affected by this injustice. Children of color are disproportionately being imprisoned at young ages as a result of misbehavior in schools. The school-to-prison pipeline is enforced by officers on campus, zero-tolerance policies, and schools giving police officers authority over students. To begin, schools first started implementing officers on campus in the 1960s in efforts to ensure the security of faculty and students. As school shootings became more prevalent in the United States, more officers were placed in schools. From 1997 to 2007, the number of officers on school campuses has increased by 1/3. Having them on campus is said to keep students safe, however, does the opposite. These officers are there to serve and protect, but too often they take advantage of their power. Not only are police officers used to intimidate students, but they also control students' behaviors and target students of color. Having police officers on campus leads to criminalization of students who are disobedient towards the zero tolerance policies of school rules. This leads to my next point. Rules and policies are set up that could potentially endanger students of color. The strict rules and zero tolerance policies in schools are enforced by the officers assigned to each individual school. Some of these zero tolerance policies have even included taking a pair of scissors to school. Students are being held accountable for small acts of misbehavior and are given harsh punishments. Studies have proven that the school-to-prison pipeline can begin for children as early as preschool. They are given harsher punishments and often made to feel as if they cannot reach a higher potential because of the color of their skin. As they grow older, they have become accustomed to being mistreated poorly by their schools and are expected to get in deeper trouble until they are handed over to the law enforcement. Consequently, young children are being turned over to be dealt with by police instead of being given the proper guidance through the school system. Instead of facing consequences on campus, students are given straight to the authorities. Schools have found a way to make it easy to get rid of the responsibility of dealing with troubled students of color by handing them over to the juvenile justice system. For these students, getting in trouble at school is their first encounter with the criminal justice system. By being turned over to police, students are made to feel as if they are not worthy of being helped and do not believe they can aspire to do much with their life. Having this mentality is detrimental to the students' future because they become used to the constant criminalization and do not attempt to break the cycle. The links show a direct correlation between troubled students of color and the criminal justice system. These students are often suspended, expelled, and even arrested for minor on-campus offenses. In Mississippi, students are routinely arrested and taken to juvenile detention centers for minor classroom misbehaviors. Black students are up to 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than their white student peers. The lack of resources that schools need to properly address when students get in trouble causes them to turn to what they believe is their only option. In conclusion, the lack of attention towards troubled students and the deficit in getting them the right kind of support leads to their incarceration down the road because they are left in the arms of the criminal justice system when they should be taken care of by their school's administration. Schools do not feel the need to handle situations with troubled students who get in trouble based on the zero tolerance policies because they find it easier to hand them over to officers who have been placed on their campuses. With this excuse of wanting to keep students safe, the government has found a way to criminalize students and send them into the criminal justice system instead of sending them off to colleges.
Finally, you will hear from Mel, who will be talking about the impact of police brutality on people of color, including the establishment of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Police brutality is nothing new to American history. In fact, it is rooted in our history, where the first police officers were actually men who were tasked to collect runaway slaves, as previously stated. Even more so, today some of the most unsatisfactory situations of police brutality occur in low-income communities of color, where the police force is predominantly white. Today I'll be reviewing the murder of Mike Brown, the Black Lives Matter movement, and all of the murders that have occurred since then. As previously stated, police abusing their power is nothing new to America. More often than not, these communities have been disproportionate due to the imbalance of power. These communities are already in poor state. Take Flint, Michigan, or Birmingham, Alabama, both POC-based, with economic issues already at hand, and the police force contributing more harm is far from helpful. Perhaps more relevant to us is the event which sparked a movement, which is the murder of Mike Brown. On the 9th of August in 2014, in Ferguson, Missouri, Brown was jaywalking from the liquor store with his friend when he was caught off guard by Darren Wilson, the white police officer who felt threatened by Brown walking away from him. When confronted, Darren Wilson decided to shoot Mike Brown. and how the Ferguson Police Department has gone about patrolling within the primarily African American community has been unconstitutional thus far, according to the Department of Justice investigation report regarding the Ferguson Police Department. Now, there is so much speculation regarding why the officer pulled up in the first place and the events that occurred in the liquor store. But regardless of your stature, there should be able to be no justification for shooting an unarmed boy who was trying to get home. Almost immediately after the murder, what appeared to be the entire black population of Ferguson seemed to retaliate in light of the murder of a loved boy. What we now know as the Ferguson unrest has become a pivotal moment in our recent history of social activism. And what had begun as a simple protest had run into a full-on battle between the people and the militarized police. Upon this, many had questioned the relationship between black people and the police, primarily how the latter has continuously abused their power against the former. The riots, which lasted almost 2 weeks, had resulted in so much pain, which had also become the face of the Black Lives Matter movement, upon the realization that the times of Jim Crow did not trail too far behind. Upon this realization, black people all over had truly come to realize that these injustices were not solely occurring in Ferguson, but in their own backyards. The establishment of Black Lives Matter sparked up an immense amount of conversation regarding race and what matters. Black Lives Matter established the need to protect black and colored lives because they are at higher risk than white lives. And despite people of color making up only about 38.5% of the population, they comprise the 51.5% of lives lost from 2015 to 2016, according to a study conducted by NBC. It is without a doubt that all lives matter. However, the purpose of Black Lives Matter is to emphasize that black and colored lives have always been at the front lines, and the first to being hurt or killed before anyone else, and in higher numbers. Brown's death was a catalyst and made the populace more aware of the increasing number of black lives being either assaulted or worse in the hands of police officers. However, despite this revelation, these murders continue to happen. And all across the US, these murders have continuously occurred with little to no reprimand for the officers at hand. The black community has endured so much pain with the consistent loss of their children, sisters, brothers, and lovers. Take Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy at the time of his murder, or Sandra Bland, who mysteriously died at the hands of a white police department, and who the white directors of HBO are now profiting off of in order to make a documentary. The murders of POC are consistent, and done so in such an amount of time that by the time that the next one happens, we've already forgotten about the previous weeks. But we must not forget their names. When we as a community see these injustices occur, it is our responsibility to act upon them, speak up for them, and speak up for what is right, to make sure that these criminals who committed the crime get the just punishment for their unprovoked actions.
From the 60s to police brutality in our current period, the impact of racism still remains, having a major impact on American history. It is a never-ending cycle. Today, we are hit by systemic racism, school-to-prison pipeline, gentrification, and environmental racism. Since then, beautiful artwork has been made from people protesting at these.
This art piece in the upper right-hand corner is from NashvillePublicRadio.org. According to NashvillePublicRadio.org, the art piece is entitled Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo and was created by San Diego-based artist Andrea Chung. She was commissioned to create this art piece, referring to gentrification. The baby bottles are molded from salt, sugar, and lard, representing the abundance of fast food and lack of grocery stores in poor neighborhoods. The crib and the high chair draw attention to the rate of death among black infants and their mothers. Suspended above the crib is an arched mobile in the shape of Interstate 40 as it cuts through North Nashville. It symbolizes how the highway divided the city's historically African-American neighborhoods. It's definitely all related, says San Diego-based artist Andrea Chung. I think it's discussing a lot of institutional racism that is prominent in pretty much every single city in the country.
And for mine, for gentrification, in the upper left-hand corner, you will see a man carrying all of the houses and going out of the city. It's basically showing that people are being displaced and being forced out of their homes and also their neighborhoods. And up top it says New Loft, saying that because of in a lot of minority communities, they are making them pretty and redoing them so that entices other groups to come in and forcing minority groups out, which that shows.
And in the bottom right-hand corner, we have a piece of art by Tara Douglas that represents how Black people have long been left exposed and vulnerable to pollution and other environmental hazards due to racial oppression and discrimination, which constrains their social mobility, political power, and economic opportunity. It was commissioned by colorofchange.org, which commissions artists of color to create depictions of what the future could look like for Black communities.
This photo in the center is from an art exhibit called Into Action from LA this past January, and it goes to show that since 1980, only one university has been built, but 22 prisons have been built. So it speaks on how Black and brown students are sent to prison more often than college.
In the lower left-hand corner, there is a picture of Edward Crawford, a Ferguson protester who was killed last year. The picture is taken by Robert Cohen, who was at the Ferguson riots at the time that they were going on.
Over 50 years have occurred since Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. His speech evoked a sense of action and one for a better future. Although much has changed to bring together a divided nation, America still has a long ways to go. With institutional racism being our new form of racism, Dr. King's words still have much prevalence.